psychological and sociological theories. So that's the third large group that we're going to talk about this week. And this one is pretty interesting because its purpose is essentially explaining human behavior affected by culture and technology. So psychological and sociological theories are trying to explain how people act based on the effects that they experience from mass media. Moving on to the next slide. Let's define psychological theories to make it a little bit straightforward. I'm sure you have seen questions like that in mass media before, in news coverage. Politicians discuss them, parents discuss them, schools discuss them. You see them in blog posts all the time. People talk about this because it's pretty natural for us to wonder, all this technology we're surrounded by, all those mass media that we use every single day, how is it affecting us as people and as a society? So questions like this: do video games really cause violence? Does violence in the movies affect audiences? How people react to negative news? Does it cause sadness, depression? Can positive music reduce depression? Maybe there's some positive effects here. Can the sound of laughter in sitcoms reduce loneliness? There's been a lot of conversation about that. Why do we hear laughter on the background when we watch sitcoms like Friends? Is that because psychologically it makes us feel less lonely? So all of those questions are essentially bringing us to the field of psychology, trying to understand the effects of mass media on our psychological state of mind. So we can define psychological theories as studies that examine what psychological effects mass media and culture can have on audiences. Moving on to the next one. One example, pretty much a historical case that gave the rise to the whole direction of psychological theories, happened in 1938 when a radio broadcast of the War of the Worlds by Herbert Wells caused mass panic in the New Jersey area. The thing is that some critics were saying that there was no mass panic, but the way mass media described this incident afterwards looked like mass panic, and that affected the viewers and the listeners way more than the broadcast itself. So there's a lot of conversation here about how mass media can affect our psychology. This incident led scientists to the question of how media and culture can affect human psychology, and a lot of scholars were trying to attempt and find that explanation. There were some findings related to this particular incident. For example, research has shown that better educated listeners were more likely to recognize that the report was fake. Even if they started listening in the middle of it, they heard it and they were more skeptical and critical about what they've heard. And they were more likely to identify that this is not real news. But in the 30s, mass communication research methodology, of course, was significantly flawed when it comes to representative sampling, when it comes to statistical methods, and so on. But overall, that's a pretty interesting finding to think about. But most importantly, this one incident really popularized the field and really popularized the whole area of psychological theories in mass communication studies. And it illustrated that culture and art transmitted through mass media can have a pretty significant effect on people. Moving on to the next slide. So what were the earliest studies on media and psychology? Just a little bit of history here. A lot of these theories are obsolete and not used by modern scholars. One of them is the hypodermic needle theory. And that's the theory that is pretty straightforward, probably the easiest theory there is in this whole course. It states that the media can change public opinion directly, like a hypodermic needle that can directly affect processes in a human body. So for example, when you get a vaccine, you are being directly affected by that vaccine because it's directly injected into your bloodstream. So this theory uses this analogy, this comparison, and states that, hypothesizes that the media can work the same way with human minds. They can directly affect our beliefs, our intentions, how we see the world, how we see events, and so on. This theory, even back in the 20th century when it was created, was actually criticized by some scholars like Paul Lazarsfeld. Lazarsfeld actually disagreed with this idea, And he said that this is not true. The media cannot directly just out of nowhere affect your mind. Because we actually have our own confirmation bias. So let's say whatever, it doesn't matter what you broadcast. If this person has pre-existing beliefs that created this confirmation bias, they already are not predisposed to believe everything they see and be directly affected by it. So Lazarsfeld was actually pretty skeptical of the hypodermic needle theory, and he was one of the earliest scholars that expressed concern with its accuracy and its predictive power. Moving on to the next slide. So let's compare what was the idea of Lazarsfeld and what was the basic idea behind the hypodermic needle theory. The first one sometimes can also be described as a one-step flow model. Very simple. We have some media content, something that you can see in mass media, and then we have mass audience. And this content directly affects mass audience. This is it. This is all that it's about. Lazarsfeld, however, believed that there has to be another part in this chain that explains what moderates the effect. So he believed that we have some mass media content that's being transmitted to opinion leaders. And if opinion leaders accept that content and they're susceptible to it, then opinion leaders will pass it on to specific groups of population. And opinion leaders, it could be anyone. It can be some famous journalist or TV anchor that you really trust. And if that TV anchor sees certain content, passes it on to their audiences, then the audiences will be affected by that content because an opinion leader has transmitted that content, not just some random person. Or an opinion leader, it can be a newspaper. Maybe you really like the New York Times. So if they print something, you really like that story and you're more susceptible to it compared to other newspapers. Or certain TV channels, certain mass media organizations. Let's say maybe you're a big fan of CNN and you're more likely to be susceptible to that content that they transmit. So that's just some of the examples. Of course, opinion leaders can be very different. It can be political leaders. It can be social media influencers. You can follow someone on Twitter who's very popular and be more susceptible to whatever content they retweet. It can be celebrities, people from the world of culture, famous singers or actors. All of that also counts as opinion leaders. It can be your local priest at a church you go to, and if they transmit some content, you will be more likely to believe it. So basically, the idea here is that it's not one-step flow of information or content. It doesn't work in just one step. There's actually two steps here. First, some information is being accepted by opinion leaders, and then it's being disseminated onto specific groups of population that this opinion leader has effect on.